Hey everyone, how were those talks in the morning? I felt Peter like drop the bomb at the end, and then he just like walked away and like had everyone else kind of figure out what he dropped. That's very cool. I'm here to talk about migrating from REST to GraphQL in the Django universe. So this talk is best suited for people who have experience with Django REST framework, who have shipped many Django apps using that framework, and are considering migrating their own needs, their organization's needs to GraphQL. And that will be specifically using the Graphene framework, which we'll talk about a little more. Quick show of hands, how many of you have used Django REST framework before? Great, that's awesome. Show of hands, how many of you have used Graphene in the Django world? Cool, great, awesome. So let's move on to, so these are the goals I was talking about. We're going to refresh ourselves on what REST and GraphQL is. I know we have a lot of different backgrounds in the audience, so some people don't necessarily come from the web world. We'll do a quick primer. We'll talk about reading data in REST and GraphQL. We'll talk about writing data. And then we're going to talk about tons of important topics that you're going to hit as you ship any web app using REST or GraphQL. And we're going to be kind of following a compare-contrast sort of model along the way so that we can be like, oh, on the left side, Django REST framework does it this way. Here's how Graphene does it. And we can kind of critique and analyze those decisions and opinions that were made by the authors of Graphene. A little bit by myself, besides what Mike said. So I've worked at some cool places. I have consulted for a lot of cool places. Through that experience, I've done a lot of corporate training and been around a lot of new engineers. And so I love talking about engineering and also doing it. And if you come tonight, you'll see this live. It's totally unrelated to the talk. It's a shameless plug. This is the prototype for the company that I'm working on. We're trying to automate men's haircuts. There's no GraphQL involved in this at all. But can we get a haircut? Perhaps if you're bold. OK, cool. What is REST? Someone shout it out. Not what it means, but what it does. How computers talk to each other. OK, what else? URLs. Endpoints. Stateless. OK, what's that word mean in this context? CRUD too. Yeah, what does stateless mean in the REST context? Right. So the server is performing each transaction without really knowing much about the client, doing it kind of one to the next. We know about REST. We've probably done this a million times where we set up an endpoint that, for example, returns movies. And we'll have a list of movies, and then we can query by the exact movie by passing an additional parameter. We can create a new movie by issuing a post command. We can update movies, and then we can delete movies. So this is your typical CRUD. CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete sort of format for a REST endpoint. For those of you who have used Django REST framework, we know that this comes all out of the box. In fact, you can write up to 5 lines of code using a view set, and all this is shipped automatically to you, which I think is really powerful. So that's what REST is. And usually we use JSON. If you're masochistic, you might use XML or SOAP. But that's what we use for REST. The Django REST framework was created by a lot of people, but it was led by a man named Tom Christie. Tom is amazing. You should, if you've used REST framework, if you've made money off of it, if any way, you should please go to this link and donate a little bit. It's really a lot of work that he's done, countless hours of support on Stack Overflow and GitHub, all to make it easier for us developers to ship code. So please check it out. This is the repository. They're at 13,000 stars. So this has been around for a while, and it's the de facto library that you would use if you're creating a REST application in Django. This is where you would go. Let's talk about GraphQL for a sec. Who knows what GraphQL is? 4 hands. 10 hands. OK, good. In GraphQL, we create a schema, and then we issue queries, mutations, and we can also subscribe. Why would we use GraphQL over REST? Can someone shout it out? Single endpoint? Tell me more. Well, we had a lot of endpoints back here. So we had multiple ones in REST. What would we have under GraphQL?
You can query multiple things in one request.
Query multiple things in one request. OK. What would I do in REST if I were trying to query multiple movies? Multiple times. So if I wanted to find out about 3 separate movies, that would be 3 HTTP requests going over the wire. Now, multiply that by a bajillion when we're talking about a serious web application, and we can see the disadvantage of REST on that axis. What are some other advantages or differences with GraphQL? The client can define the schema. OK, tell me more. Right. So with REST, the server is deciding what you're going to get back. That's fixed. With GraphQL, you can choose the fields that you want. For a movie, I don't want the title and the description and everything. Maybe I just want the ID back. The client can just say, hey, server, give me back just the IDs for these separate movies. That's pretty powerful. There's less being sent over the wire that's unused. And 2, the client can be flexible. How many of us have been on the back-end side of things and have worked with the front-end dev, and it's like pulling teeth, communicating, oh, this endpoint does this, and it gives you back these fields and these types. It's such a pain. With GraphQL, the front-end dev just checks out a schema that comes with a specialized endpoint that returns a schema that basically returns everything the server can return, field names and types. That cuts down on so much communication. No need to generate a Swagger sort of documentation middle thing. It comes out of the box. Any other differences about GraphQL versus REST? Oh, yeah, about subscriptions, yes. I have less experience with these, so I can't expound on that. But yes. With REST, how would you achieve a subscription? Do we know what subscription means in this case? Like a real-time connection? So like WebSockets, for example? Under REST, I don't actually think you wouldn't be able, you're not able to perform this using Django REST framework because it's single endpoints. Under GraphQL and Graphene, it's still in development, but you can subscribe to an endpoint and get real-time updates. Question?
I think in REST, if you wanted something like subscription, you'd need another client to basically trigger, oh, you need to send this out.
Oh, interesting. OK. Would it be related to channels in any way on the backend side? Or is it just the front? OK. Cool. Let's talk about Graphene. So if you are building a web app in the Django world that you want to implement the GraphQL spec, you will be using Graphene. Graphene was started in 2016 by a guy named Cyrus, who has since moved on. It is used by Yelp, Reddit, Mozilla, and as of recently, the city of San Francisco for a small app, not their main app. Specifically, you'll be using the Graphene Django package. This has about 2,200 stars, so a lot less a lot less usage than Django REST framework, but it's been around, it hasn't been around as long. There's 40 few, and sorry, let me back up. I'm trying to critique the health and state of this open source project, and I hope all of you, as you kind of come across a library, you look for certain signals, so I'm just processing those signals. I see 44 issues outstanding. This used to be 200 a couple months ago. I see 11 pull requests. This used to be about 40 a couple months ago. So this sounds sort of healthy to me, but I guess this is a little bit of a flag. Something to think about. Oh, and last commit 8 hours ago. So looks active.
So is this package only for Django, or there is the Flash version, native version?
There's a Flash version. It's not very well supported. The main web framework Graphene supports is Django. All right, let's dig in. Let's compare. So queries in GraphQL are how we retrieve data. We're not changing anything. We're just retrieving it. This would be same thing as issuing a get HTTP request command under the REST world. On the left side, we have how things are done using the Django REST framework. And on the right side, we have how it would be done using Graphene. In this case, we're implementing a simple, on the left side, we're implementing a simple endpoint to retrieve a note. For those of you who are familiar, we get an ID passed in, we find the note, and that code isn't actually here because it knows that the model is a note, so this actually issues a database command to retrieve that note. It gets serialized using this note serializer. Look at how little code we have to do. We're literally just specifying what fields we want, and it automatically handles it for us. And then we return that response. So this is how we would do things in the REST world. On the right side, we have to specify a type and connect it to the model. So this is the same note that's being referred to over here. And then we have to create a query class that specifies how to resolve a note. And so there's this concept in Graphene of resolvers. It's a fancy word for just specifying how to retrieve a certain thing, in this case, notes. Pretty simple to follow as well. We get the ID passed in of the note, and then we run the command ourselves to fetch that note. And this will get kind of auto-packaged into this type. These fields will get extracted, and that'll get shipped to the client. That makes sense. Raise your hand if you're confused. OK. Does the left side make sense? Great. So the right side is a little great. We are specifying a way to retrieve a note object by its ID using Graphene. So if I'm a backend developer, I'm implementing this in the Django world. In my Django app, I have added the Graphene Django package already. I didn't show that step. And then now I'm implementing the schema, of which one point is this query. Mutations, fancy word for operations that change the backend, the database, so updates, deletes, creations. Left side, Django REST framework. The only new thing is that we're validating whether the serializer is validating the data that came in. So this is just checking if the client satisfied its requests, and then it's just returning whether it's been created or not. Notice no database command is being written here. That's being abstracted away for us. That's a common theme in Django REST framework. In Graphene, we do the same thing as above, and then we create a create note mutation, and we subclass this class. And then we check for the arguments, and then we create the note ourselves right here. And sorry, this should be note model.objects.create. So we're actually issuing a Django object database creation command. There's some text missing here. So far, putting on my opinion hat, seems pretty comparable. I'm not writing too much more code or too less code. There doesn't seem to be any magic going on, which is to me like a strike against using a library or a package. It seems everything is more or less explicit. Question? Yes. So you would probably create like another class called update note, and then that would be the command issued by the client side. It'd be a totally different mutation. Yeah. So the client would probably call update note in this case, and for that mutation, an ID would be required, which the server would mandate, and all that would be like automatically seen on the client side. Yeah.
The only thing that feels like magic in Graphene is compared to DRF, like I'm seeing the post method, right? So I'm thinking, okay, it's probably an HTTP post ver kind of thing.
Yeah.
I'm seeing HTTP 201 created. Okay, I get it. We're talking HTTP. But on Graphene, there's nothing related to HTTP. So are they trying to get away from that? Like, is that purposely obscured? Are they using those things that just don't expose them? That's the only thing that feels magical. Like, well, what are you really doing on the wire?
Yeah. This is a GraphQL topic. So if you were using any framework in any programming language, all those errors and information like metadata are communicated inside of the payload. REST decided to piggyback off of the HTTP method and use that to communicate what's going on. That is not the case in the GraphQL world. So you can issue a command, a mutation that fails, that's still a 200 OK, but you'll in the errors part of the response, it'll be like something messed up. Let's talk authentication. So in Django REST framework, we get these great global settings that we can set and some granular ones too. We're mandating that every endpoint that we create, unless otherwise specified, requires the out-of-the-box session authentication. So a person has to be logged in. And here we can kind of unwind those things if we wanted to. We're kind of doubling it up, but if we made this empty, this endpoint could be accessed by an anonymous user. In Graphene land, we do get a class that we can use, but that's kind of it. And on the granular side of things, you actually have to use a third-party library to do this kind of work. To take a mutation and be like, oh, only admins can run this mutation. That does not come out of the box with Graphene, which I think is a strike against it. You have to use a third-party library. I prefer the one by flavors, and I think it's GraphQL.jwt. I also use a lot of JSON Web Tokens. Authorization. Okay, so we kind of get the same song and dance with REST framework, which is awesome. Here we're creating a permission, even specifying what happens if that permission is not met, and then we're applying it to an endpoint. That's great. This is really cool. I've used this so many times to kind of segment people by their role and what they can do. We can't do that in Graphene on the global level. And again, we have to import a third-party library to perform this kind of granular permission segmenting. I think that's another strike against Graphene. So far, some things are at parity, some things are missing. Good things to think about as we decide what technology to use at our organizations. Performance. So this is you have to kind of look into the crystal ball. This area needs a little more investigation. I did some quick, like, non-scientific calculations on my laptop, and I saw basic parity with retrieving a single user over and over again, but I didn't test for volume and retrieving like tens of thousands of objects in one go. So there's more work to be done there. However, there are outstanding issues with Graphene's performance. Dan, who is a contributor to Graphene, tried to retrieve 35,000 products and saw almost a query taking close to 14 seconds, which is a little insane, using Graphene. Now, there's no comparison made to Django REST framework, so I don't know what it is around there, but just order of magnitude wise, that sounds off to me. I don't think you'd be hitting 14 seconds off a REST endpoint. So there are inefficiencies with Graphene, and the team is actively looking at it. Here's another issue. So I know this might be hard to read, but we're issuing a query. So we're on the client side. We're issuing a query about teams, and then we're also finding the members inside those teams. This results in one database query for the teams, and then another 5 for selecting members inside of each of those teams. This is known as the N+1 problem. Graphene suffers from it. I haven't done an exact comparison to REST, but we also know with REST that we control a lot more of how we're fetching things in the database, and we can use select related or prefetch related so that we stay within one database command and not having multiple transactions. So this is, I would say, another strike against Graphene. Caching. This is an area that I have the least experience in, but I wanted to put it there just to get a surface level view of how things are done. In Django REST framework, we have a method decorator, comes out of the box. In Graphene, we have a data loader that also comes out of the box. So it seems that both libraries offer ways to cache, which is important because, as we know, for an average request to our server, what takes up the most time in all that? Usually the DB, yeah. By like, it's almost probably averaging close to 50 or 60% of the time for processing that request is with the DB. So you can circumvent some of that using caching, yeah.
So we talked about client caching? Like
Server, yeah. This is all server. Yeah. I imagine, like, behind the scenes, that's roughly what they're doing, or storing something in memory. Documentation. Onboarding is getting better for Graphene. It hasn't historically been great, but there's been a lot of great people hard at work. DRF is just a lot more. It's a lot more detailed. There's just so much more there that I'm able to get to an answer to a question a lot quicker in the DRF world. There's a lot more Stack Overflow questions with DRF. With Graphene, there's more work to be done on the examples libraries. I talked about deep dive and corner cases. This is more likely to be done. That said, the Graphene team is great on GitHub, and if you are going to ask a question, you will most likely get a response, which I talk about here. There's great coverage on GitHub issues. You will get a response within like at least 2 days if you ask a question about Graphene. The team's great. There's a Slack channel, which I'll share soon. I wouldn't say Stack Overflow is great for getting an answer to Graphene. It's just our community doesn't really hang out there. It's mostly been on GitHub issues. I want to give a quick shout out to these fine folks, Mel, Jonathan, Paul, David, and a lot more that I'm missing. They've been they put in so much work, so much time creating Graphene, making it better, trying to get it to parity with Django REST framework along the criteria that we've talked about in the past. There's more work to be done, but you can't thank these folks enough for carrying the ball forward. No presentation in the Bay Area would be complete without a pitch. So I'll come back to we want feedback, but come help. This is an open source project. I'm a contributor to it. It's only going to get better. It's the de facto library for GraphQL if you're in the Django world. So its potential is huge. It's going to be used by so many more people down the line. This is an excellent time to get in, to contribute, to become a core contributor. We have a Bay Area cohort of us kind of loosely distributed, and it's a great time to join. We have a Slack channel where you're welcome to ask questions and also get involved in the development. And for those of you who have used Graphene in this room, please come find me and give me feedback, because I'm going to take that straight back to the team to improve the tool. Any questions? Do we have time for questions? Cool. Any questions? Yes?
I use CRUD as a tool to test VRF, in development. Can CRUD be used for this too?
100%. 100%. We you're just issuing different stuff in the payload, but everything is still being done using an HTTP request. Yeah. So if something catastrophic goes on, Graphene will catch the exception and probably throw over 400. So I guess I would call those like, I don't know, really, really, really bad exceptions. For like business logic exceptions, the practice is to create an error code or text and embed that in the payload. And then it gets sent over the wire to the client, and then you just tell the client what to do based on that. I think it's more like you define it. Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah. Say that again. Oh, for that so you can expand the resolvers to bring in custom fields. So basically, when you create your type, that type has some capabilities of a serializer, and you can add custom fields to that type, and then that custom field has its own resolver. Cool. Thanks, everybody. Is that good on time? Sweet. Awesome.